big event. I'm afraid to say that the sweepstake on how long Ted was going to speak for has in fact been cancelled, because he tells me it will take less than an hour. And I've been taking bets on over an hour. It's, as I explained to one visitor already, there was a long record of Ted giving lectures at about this time of year, about the First World War, Second World War. He said he was retiring from it, but he's been persuaded back into the ranks to speak about this big event. Now, I don't know, most of the people here, I'm looking, may actually remember this. I remember Korea coming up on the news, but it was, in my mind, it got muddled up with the Chinese attacking Formosa and at the same time. So I'm looking forward to having Ted explain it to me in detail. So over to you, Ted.
Good afternoon, those here and any of those of you who are online. I've just done it. I'm absolutely petrified, because after I watched back my Angel of Mons talk, I realized just how often I say so I've just done one. We'll see how many more I can get in. The genesis of this talk goes back to pre-COVID, and Alan Topless said to me, this next year is the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. It's the forgotten war. Would you like to, do you think you could do a talk on it? I was rather hoping to give it in June of 2020 on the 70th anniversary of the start of the war. That, of course, wasn't possible. And so it's ended up yet again as a remembrance lecture. And I do promise I am going to retire from remembrance lectures one of these days. I've studied the Korean War in the past, but only strategically. And I'll hint on some of those issues right at the end. They mainly operate around limited war, nuclear warfare, and so on. So it's been an absolutely fascinating study over the last 18 months or so to learn a lot more about the war. The sad thing is that I don't have enough time to tell you about it, but I've learned a lot, and so I've been really grateful for the opportunity to do that. All I'm going to do today is to scan over quite quickly. I'm going to look at the historical background and terrain. And in that historical background, while this map's up, you should be aware, I haven't used my pointer because the people online can't see it, but if you look at the top of the map, it's mostly China, but not completely. Top right-hand corner of the map, there is a hook round from Siberia. So Russia had a way in and a lot of influence over Korea. And then to the right-hand side of the map, you've got Japan sort of hooking round, and the bottom right-hand corner, you are quite close to the southern Japanese islands. So you have, it's a little bit like Poland, where you had the Russian, Prussian, and Austro-Hungarian empires all pushing to for control, territory, and so on. Well, the same has happened to Korea over hundreds and hundreds of years. And I'll come on to that again in a moment. After that, we're going to look at the North Korean invasion on the 25th of June, 1950, which triggered the whole thing. We'll look at the UN response when they'd had a chance to build up their forces. Then compliments of General Douglas MacArthur. They brought the Chinese in, which had never been an intention. In fact, it had been deliberately not an intention. And then I'm going to skate pretty quickly over almost the last 2.5 years of the war, because the interesting stuff from the point of view of what we're looking at today is what went on quite early. And then a little bit more interesting is what happened as you came towards the armistice, and I'll talk about that. It's interesting to note that the armistice was on the 27th of July, 1953, and Stalin had died only a few months earlier. And really, it was Stalin's death and the new Russian government's wish not to be involved in this particular war that allowed it to end. Otherwise, it could have gone on for a very much longer time. And as I said, I'll look at the concept of limited war towards the end. Right, historically, there are two major wars that we want to look at. I don't want to go further back than that. The Japanese were beginning to exert themselves. If you think the Americans had caused them to open up in the 1850s and 1860s, and they were beginning to exert themselves. And their first war was with the Chinese, the Sino-Japanese War, which they won quite easily. The Chinese forces were really very, very ancient against modern forces. And after that war in 1894-95, Japan took more influence and some territorial involvement in Korea, which it hadn't had for some time. The major war was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which nearly brought down the Tsar and was again an easy win for the Japanese. It was studied by a lot of people looking at what the First World War might look like. And those people who say, well, it came as a complete shock. Most of the soldiers had studied this war, so it didn't come as quite as much of a shock as people might think. It was after that war that the Japanese stepped in and they made Korea a protectorate. And then in 1910, they annexed it completely. And at that point, their aim was to crush Korean culture. They wanted Korea to be, in effect, part of Japan. And the way they did that, they created a civil service of all the power was in the hands of the Japanese, but they created a civil service of educated Koreans. But the only way you could get an education was in a Japanese way and to lose all your Korean culture. And that was the way they were working. Now, there was opposition to that from the very first. In fact, Syngman Rhee, who we're going to talk about in a moment, was first imprisoned in about 1896, when he was quite a young, 1898, sorry, when he was 18, for beginning to object to the domination which Japan was producing even after the Sino-Japanese War. So this went on. And there were a number of independence movements. I'm just going to look at two because they're the two that are most relevant to what we're going to look at today. After 1910, an independent government was set up in exile in China because China, if you remember at that stage, was nationalist. The communists don't come along till 1949. That in turn, during the Second World War, led to something called the Korean National Army, which was closely allied to Chiang Kai-shek, who at the time was, of course, involved in conflict with Mao Zedong for the domination of China. Syngman Rhee was to become the South Korean president in 1948, and he stayed there till 1960. At the start of the war, he was 70. He hadn't spent most of that time in China. He'd spent most of it in America, part of it in Hawaii, and a good deal of the rest on the American mainland. He'd got his first degree, his master's degree, and his PhD at American universities. And he operated for that government sitting in China as their main Western envoy. Now, the idea of setting up South Korea in 1948 by the Americans was to create a democratic state. Well, Syngman Rhee was the last person you wanted to run a democratic state. If you went far enough back, he was related to former kings of Korea. And he was a tyrant, frankly. And he was totally the wrong man to lead that army, or to lead that country. Now, another organization was the Northeast Anti-Japanese Army, which in the Second World War led to the Korean Volunteer Army, which was allied through the Second World War to Mao Zedong. And prominent here, not the leader, but prominent always, was Kim Il-sung, 20 years younger than Syngman Rhee, and had been in and around the area, either China or Korea, for most of his life. So you've got two men with very, very different views. Korea was liberated by the Russians at the end of 1945, by the Russians from the north and the Americans from the south. And as so often, a parallel, in this case the 38th parallel, was a convenient line to draw on the map, completely ignoring river systems, and things like that, which would have given a much more definable border. The Americans were hoping that the Russian area in the north and the American area in the south could have single elections, which would lead to a unified country. But that was really always pie in the sky. The Americans ended up having their elections early in 1948, and Syngman Rhee won with about 90% of the vote. The North Korean elections were some months later, and they were the kind of election where Kim Il-sung was nominated and elected. The Soviets pulled out in 1948 after that election, and the Americans a year later. So there we are in 1949 with the main forces out. You've got the communist-inspired Kim Il-sung in the north, and you've got the American-inspired Syngman Rhee in the south. The communists, as you'd expect, were fomenting an awful lot of revolution in the south, and Syngman Rhee wasn't really the kind of chap to sort of work with these groups. His idea was to exterminate them. So there was quite a lot of opposition to him in the south, and that gave Kim Il-sung a great deal of optimism that if he invaded, then he'd find a pretty open door to push at. And I'll go back onto that in a minute. Before I do, I just want to look at this idea of terrain and weather. The big picture that you can see on the top left, the white is snow. And the terrain is fairly normal, except in the south and west when it's flatter. And the terrain gets worse the further north that you get. The highest mountains are only 6,000 feet above sea level, but they are severe and sharp and steep. Well, there were tracks always, but from the time that railways were established, the railway system was the main way of getting around in Korea. And it was based on an X in Seoul. So Seoul is sort of middle left, and you then went up that coast, across that coast, down here, and across to Busan. So that X is the main railway system with a whole pile of minor lines going off it. I put a railway bridge on the screen. It's one that the Americans had bombed. They were actually quite difficult to knock down, but the major bridges were all railway bridges. They weren't road bridges. The other point that I wanted to make is that Korea is extremely cold and dry in the winter. And that made it, one of the books that I've been reading is one that Trevor very kindly gave me to review, and that's about the air war. I'm not going there today, but the author of that, was a British jet pilot, made the point that it was very much easier. You could guarantee air power in the winter, but you couldn't guarantee it in the summer because the number of clouds over the hills. Right, on the 25th of June, when the North attacked, not only was the Republic of Korea, South Korea, in effect, totally unprepared, but so were the Americans. They neither had any expectation, to the extent that Seoul, you can see it there now, it's literally just beside the first blue line. And Seoul was taken within 4 days, and that was the South Korean capital. It had previously been the capital of a unified Korea some time ago. On the 25th of June, the United Nations came up with a resolution condemning the attack. Now, it was able to do that because the Russians were boycotting the United Nations as a result of America recognizing Chiang Kai-shek as a separate country in Taiwan. And nothing changes, does it? We see the same thing coming to fruition now. And so they boycotted. The Mao's government still wasn't acknowledged as a government which could sit in the United Nations. So it meant that the Security Council could get that resolution through. That was Resolution 82. 2 days later, it came up with Resolution 83, which authorized forces to go to Korea to assist the South Koreans. Now, that in effect was the Americans. There were other forces, we joined later, and so did 16 other forces from around the world, some European, some from Southeast Asia. The US troops who came initially were from Japan, and they were very poorly trained. Douglas MacArthur was something of an iconoclast, I suppose. He got to the top of the American army in the 1930s, and on merit, a very talented officer. But he commanded in Southeast Asia throughout the war. And we had Mountbatten there, of course, two of the biggest egos I can think of in history, both commanding in Southeast Asia at that time. And both egos got bigger while they were there. MacArthur was then put in charge of two things. He was both in charge of the government of Japan as a protectorate of that stage of the US, and he was also commander-in-chief of the American forces. He concentrated totally on the political side. The forces were ill-trained. One guy said, one report I said that they had too much food, too much time, and too much sex, and in the bars and brothels, and they just weren't ready for warfare. The first American force to go in was called Task Force Smith, and that was completely routed. Max Hastings, in his book, written some time ago in 1985, I think, describes in his first chapter what it was like to be an American soldier in Task Force Smith, and the sheer horror of what they were facing and their sheer inability to do anything about it. And that meant that as you can see from that map, that the North, I'm going to go on using South and North Korea, it's easier, that North Korea was able to advance very quickly. It may surprise you to know that both sides were purging people in the South. Syngman Rhee was purging, and we're talking killing, about anybody who he thought might be remotely helpful to the communists. And as the communists went south, they were doing exactly the same. So an awful lot of the intelligentsia, people of power, councillors, that kind of thing, were actually very early on, and many of them were killed in that first period in 1950. In the bottom right-hand corner there, you can see the Pusan, bottom right is the Pusan perimeter, and that's where the Germans and, sorry, the Americans and the South Koreans made their stand. And then slowly they brought in forces. That's where the British joined, for instance, in September of 1950. They came from Hong Kong, and there were about 90 South Staffords attached to the Middlesex Regiment and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. So we didn't have a major involvement, our own local forces, but there were some of them there right at the beginning. You got a situation which you often get when you have these rapid advances. The NKPA, that's the North Korean People's Army, began to have supply problems simply because of the sheer length of their supply lines. That wasn't helped because the Americans had complete control of the sea, and they had several aircraft carriers sitting in the Sea of Japan anyway. And so they were able to make it very difficult for the NKPA to move by day. So they had to hide by day and then move their stores at night. So they get weakened, and that's often the case with this. But I'd sort of, I don't know, always got an idea that the Pusan perimeter was held pretty easily. But actually, all the reading I've been doing suggests that there was bitter fighting there at that stage very early on, as there was to be much later. And the fight to hold the perimeter really began to show American resolve to take this thing seriously. By the end of August, you've got a situation where the UN has something like 180,000 forces, and the North Koreans have only about 100,000. So you're starting to see a change in the balance. This thing comes up a little bit on the top of my screen, so just turn around and see, oh, it's on that one too. This is the UN response, effectively the American response, mainly with South Korean forces. And there are two elements to it. The first is the landings at Incheon. And if you look at the map there, you can see Japan on the right, hooking in to the south of Korea. And as you follow around, some of the troops came from Tokyo on the right, some came from the south, some actually came from the Busan perimeter, and they move around and they hook in at Incheon. Now, I spelt it without an E, it's got an E in currently, but that's the way it was spelt at the time, so that's what I'm doing. And they were led by the US Marines. Now, the US, like all countries, had purged their armed forces after the Second World War. The main strike force was in Europe, but their Marine divisions have always been good and well trained. And so they landed at Incheon and they took on 3 beaches, and they took Incheon within about 2 days, the port itself. And you can see there that they led, a Marine division led spearheaded a force of 750,000 troops. There is an exact figure for ships, but I suspect it's because you can measure ships easier than troops. I've just said more than 250. The big problem was this had become known as Operation Common Knowledge in Tokyo. And so they had to produce a deception plan, and they produced a major deception plan for a port called Busan, which is further down the coast on the left-hand side, but south of Incheon. I think the thing that we ought to know about this, I'm going to be very critical. I've already been very critical of MacArthur, and I'll be a lot more critical of him in due course. This was his high point. He fought for this. It was a difficult landing to do. Sea landings are always difficult anyway. Look at the efforts that went into preparing for D-Day. And all the planners in the States and in Japan were saying to him, "So you can't do this." Now, this is one time where his bombastic nature worked. He said, "Make it work," and they did. And so I think it is his high point. The only problem is it built his ego up even more than it had before. The 2 pictures that you've got there, bottom left as you look, is MacArthur on a battleship. One of the criticisms of him is he never spent a night in Korea. He was either on a ship or he was in Tokyo. So that was when he came to be sacked, that was leveled at him. And he's on a battleship there. I put the next picture in because that tank, if any of you are interested in Second World War, that is a T-34. So that indicates where the armament's coming from. It's essentially coming for the North Koreans. It's essentially coming from Russia. And as you can see that they were able to move very quickly from Incheon, which is quite close, and they were able to, in about 10 days, they were about to take Seoul back. I put 2 dates there, 25 and 28. The Americans were frantic to have Seoul captured on the 3 months after the start of the war, to say, look how quick we've got back. In fact, they had some troops fighting on the outskirts. They didn't really take it. They couldn't really say it was secure for 3 days later, but they did take Seoul. The other arm of the attack was the Busan breakout. So you've hooked around to the left, and now you're going to punch in from below. And they built up considerable superiority of forces. It was, again, difficult fighting. It wasn't easy to break out. To begin with, they broke out to the north, and then when they'd sucked in enough troops to the north, then they did a subsidiary attack and broke out to the west. And this is the Busan perimeter with the blue line there. I don't know if you can see if you're in the audience, but there's a series of red squares on there, which are Korean forces. And there's one, they come all the way down to the left, but there's an American push, goes on to the left there. So it was the American 8th Army, and it was supported by South Korea, Republic of Korea troops. They wanted to do two things. First of all, they wanted to prevent those troops being used to reinforce Incheon and then Seoul, and they managed that. But the second thing they wanted to do was to actually encircle the North Koreans and make it impossible for them to get back to North Korea. In the whoops, we have a crisis. Thanks, Chris. In the end, they were so determined to take Seoul, the Americans, that they perhaps missed an opportunity to close the door to North Koreans fleeing north. So something like 40,000 were, remember I've used this before, casualties refers to killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. So there's a casualty figure of about 40,000 for the North Koreans, but about 30,000 escape. And they're going to form the basis of a new army, which the Russians are going to re-equip. Maybe the Americans could have actually pushed straight across Korea and tried to stop there. So those two breakouts in September, and where are we now? We only started the war in June, and already we've had two major activities. This map is actually a timeline map for the whole of the war, but it was the best one I could find to illustrate what I want here. And I want you to look at the yellow lines going north. On the 27th of September, MacArthur was given a slightly open-ended directive to defeat the North Korean forces, to reunite Korea, but to only use the Republic of Korea forces, the South Korean forces, to do it. And being the man he was, he fought back and said, no, I don't like this at all. I need to have Americans to do this. And he actually declared himself that unless I'm told otherwise, I will use all the UN forces to go north of the 38th parallel. Nobody either at the UN or in the US told him to stop. So he was never given a directive to do this. He just said, I'm going to do it unless you tell me I can't. And they moved up. At the same time, China threatened any invasion of North Korea would involve them in the war. But in fact, that didn't happen. They later said, if you come within 100 miles, but even that didn't happen. But it got to a point, which we'll come to in a moment, where the Chinese were seriously worried they were going to be invaded. And on the 24th of October, MacArthur announced that his forces had the right to go right up to the Chinese border and to take any offensive action there that they deemed necessary, including going onto Chinese territory. He was immediately slapped down by the State Department and by the Pentagon, but he went on ahead and did it anyway. And this is what I'm talking about this massive ego and the problems that he caused. So they push up onto the Yalu River on the north, and they go right up to the northeast. And it's up in the northeast in November 1950 that they get it the closest to the Chinese mainland. And we'll see what's going to happen. On the 19th of October, Chinese troops started to infiltrate on foot. The Americans didn't know they were there, the South Koreans didn't know they were there, and nor did any other of the forces, because by now our Commonwealth Brigade was actually involved up in the north as well. The Chinese spent a week moving their forces into position. Then on the 26th of October, they started probing attacks. There were 3 battles, but they were really not major battles. They were just designed to see if they could find out where the American strengths and weaknesses were. Then they, after that, they withdrew behind the North Koreans. And the Americans were saying, that's all right, they've just tested their muscles a bit, they're scared, they don't like what they see, and all will be well. In fact, what the Chinese discovered was that the Americans were petrified of being surrounded and were also petrified of fighting at night. Now, I've never been surrounded, but I share the view. I always hated fighting at night. And the Chinese and North Koreans seem to be quite happy doing that. And so it becomes a feature of this war right through to the end, that an awful lot of the attacks, Chinese attacks, happen at night. The other factor with that, of course, is it reduces considerably the power of the United Nations / American air power and artillery. So we see so even in that first week, they come up with a conclusion which they follow through for some years. Because of what they thought was okay, the Americans came up with, for the whole of the UN, they were going to start on the 25th of November, the home by Christmas attacks, which meant we are going to completely decimate the North Koreans. We're going to take the whole of Korea. It will be unified under Western American control, and then we can all go home. And it was a bit like First World War over by Christmas. Same day, they hit the second phase of the Chinese attack hit. And it hit in 2 areas. To the west, it was called the Chongchon River. And on the east, they hit a massive reservoir and hydroelectric system called the Chosan Reservoir. I couldn't resist this. A lot of my military history reading comes because Trevor asked me to review books. And this is one I looked at a couple of years ago. And I love the idea that the 1st Marine Division, US Marine Division, called themselves the Frozen Chosen. Because remember what I said about the weather? And this turns out, the winter of 1950-51 turns out to be, even by Korean standards, bitter. And the more men were actually lost on both sides to frostbite than actually succumbed to battle wounds. And I just love the idea. It's a cracking book, actually. It's really well written. And in the chap who introduces it really gets stuck into MacArthur and helped to actually cover my views on him, really. So they're now making 2 major offensives. They were still right up in the north of Korea, but they're really hitting those United Nations forces hard. So we've had a first phase. This is the Chinese second phase. In the end, the United Nations forces, it isn't that they're beaten, they cannot sustain. We're talking about, again, the problems of supply lines. They cannot sustain themselves up in the north of Korea. So they start pulling back. And lo and behold, where do we get back to? We get back to the 38th parallel. And that is where most of the fighting for the rest of the war is going to go on. The Chinese called their army the People's Volunteer Army. In theory, it was willing Chinese who went to help their communist brothers in North Korea. And it wasn't an official Chinese army, but it was about 300,000 strong. So there were a lot of very willing volunteers. But anyway, that's what I've put there, the PVA. They took Seoul on the 4th of January, 51. So it's in the South hands, North get it, South / Americans get it back, North Korea's got it back again. On the 14th of January 51, Mao issued a message to his troops saying, we are going to push these people right out of the Korean Peninsula. There will be a spring offensive, and that's when it will happen. And throughout January 1951, there had been peace negotiations. We're back on the 38th parallel. The United Nations are saying to the Chinese, North Koreans, and the Russians, look, it's all been for nothing. Why don't we stop? And it was Mao, actually. He was a smaller partner to Stalin to begin with, but by now Mao's really got the bit between his teeth, and he's determined to push on. And in the beginning of February 51, there is another United Nations resolution condemning the Chinese as warmongers. And again, Chinese and Russians aren't there to defend them. The People's Volunteer Army tried a 4th phase, and this was to push further to set them up for this major spring offensive, but it failed. They took ground, but you've got some fairly serious battles, but there are no, in strategic terms, there are no major movements at this point. So you now move in 1951, through into 52, into a period of stalemate. Now, remember though that MacArthur had got right to the Chinese border. he'd been pushed right back to the 38th parallel. He, at that stage, was starting to talk about use of nuclear weapons. And he was starting to talk about possibly 14 nuclear devices blown along the line between the North and the South, which would then create a zone that the North Koreans couldn't get through anymore. Not surprisingly, it was vetoed. He also wanted, at that stage, to use nuclear bombs on China. And not surprisingly, that was also vetoed. At about this time, Clement Attlee, who in 51 is coming to the end of his time as Prime Minister, he actually, we think of Attlee as being mainly interested in home policy and setting up the NHS and all of that. But actually, at this point, he went to America to speak to Truman, the American president, to say, please convince, and on behalf of a lot of other nations, to say, please promise us you're not going to use nuclear weapons. All Truman would say is, we will use everything in our armory to protect South Korea. But he didn't actually say, yes, we will use nuclear weapons. And this becomes a big issue, but I'll just talk about a few other things now. By the beginning of March 51, Stalin, Mao Zedong goes to Stalin and say, I need supplies from you. And Stalin has been surprised, but initially Stalin gave his permission for Kim Il-sung to advance and said, but you'd better check with Mao. But Mao didn't really have much say in it. If Stalin had said you can go, Mao said, okay, you know, if Stalin agrees, I'll agree. But now you're beginning to see more equal partnerships, although the industrial might at this stage is still with the Russians. But the Russians now send air force and anti-aircraft troops into this battle. So for the first time, you've now got Russians. It's mainly in the air, and you're mainly getting battles now between the Russian MiGs and the American Sabres. The chap who wrote the air book said the slower jets really couldn't compete. These two, I think it's a MiG-15 and I think the Sabre 85, were the fast jets, and they were the ones who did most damage and who people were most concerned about. So the Russians are really starting to get involved. As you can see on there, 13th of March, finally, Seoul is taken for the last time and doesn't change hands again. By now, it was completely destroyed. Think pictures you've seen of Lebanon, Beirut in its time, the things you've seen in Syria and so on. That's, if you see have a look at some of the pictures, that's what it's looking like. People are living in cellars, they're living like animals. Just that short period, just to show how the Chinese suffered, they suffered 30,000 casualties in just those few months where they're trying to do their fourth phase. And that's really why they don't push on any further. I don't want you to think it's all stopped. And when I say constant low-level battles, these battles might involve 40,000 Chinese and probably a brigade, or two brigades, say 10,000 men of the United Nations forces. The Turks were very prominent. The Commonwealth Brigade was also very prominent, and they were the South Koreans, and the Americans were the main people taking part in the major fighting. So when I say low level, only low level if you're instinct strategic. If anyone was able to watch the Tony Robinson Forgotten Battles, he got there ahead of me, I'm afraid, but it was quite interesting to watch. And you hear those soldiers, British soldiers, talking about what it felt like to be in those battles. They didn't feel low level to them. But if you're looking at it from a strategic point of view, they're around a hill or a series of hills or a river crossing. They're not going to make a major strategic difference to the war. So, 1 April 51, Truman finally sacks MacArthur. MacArthur should have been sacked over getting too close to China. In fact, he should have been sacked before he could suck China into this war. But the problem with him was he was a massive hero. He's over 70 as well. He's been the American Chief of Staff in the 30s. He's the hero of Southeast Asia. And Truman wasn't particularly popular at this time. And Truman didn't have the courage to sack him. And even when he did sack him, there was a major outcry from the American people, and it went on for some time, about how he'd been badly dealt with. Congress very quickly examined the reasons for the sackings, and they said that MacArthur had broken the terms of the American Constitution and by disobeying the president, and therefore he should have been sacked. But people in America didn't think it, and Truman didn't sack him for months and months and months because he knew that the massive public support that MacArthur had in America. So what are the reasons? One is disloyalty. He is now regarding himself as pretty well a country, the commander of this UN force, and he's talking behind the Americans' back to American allies and saying, you know, if I do this, will you support me? The Americans had a problem. You don't normally want to admit you're spying on your allies. So the Americans couldn't use the evidence, which they knew, that he was talking to their allies, because otherwise they'd have to admit they were spying on them. So for that period, they couldn't use that as a reason. I've already talked about nuclear weapons and some of the madcap views that MacArthur had. But the thing that finally did for him, he made it clear that he expected to be allowed to invade China. And by now, any sensible person would see how Mao's newly formed communist China was going to fight to defend its territory. And so really this man he'd lost it. And at that stage, Truman had to take the chance of public unpopularity. It is cited as one of the reasons why Truman didn't stand for the Democrats against Eisenhower in the 1952 election, because of he was unpopular for a number of reasons, but sacking MacArthur was one of them. So that had a major effect, if you like, on world politics too. And the other thing that I want to put in there is the Chinese Air Force has now been supplied by the Russians and trained. And so the Russians are pulling out of the air war now. It's their MiGs, but they've now got Chinese pilots. I've covered very quickly nearly 2 years of the war. So why am I suddenly picking up? If you look on various websites, history websites, there's about 5. Britannica's one, Wiki obviously is there, and there are several other websites. Most of them don't break it down in this way, but some other books I have do. That they just talk about stalemate right through from 51 until the armistice. But other books look at this period, and you've got the USSR. So there have been armistice talks going on from the beginning of 52, and some of the battles in 52 have been a matter of trying to get better conditions. But there are 4 in particular. Pork Chop Hill concerned the Americans. The Battle of the Hook was actually the Argyll Sutherland Highlanders, and then followed by the Duke of Wellington's regiment. And again, if you watch the Tony Robinson thing, you'll hear a soldier from the Duke of Wellington's regiment talking how horrific it was. At one stage, they retreated into a tunnel, and the North Korean forces blockaded the end of the tunnel. Luckily, they spent about 24 hours in the dark, no food, no water. But luckily, the Chinese were pushed off, and the engineers were able to blow them and get them out again. But the last battle was as close as the Battle of Kum Song, which goes on until the day the armistice is signed. And nobody could understand why they were doing it. The Chinese North Koreans were straightening their line, which is a good thing to do militarily. The less kinks you've got in a line, the easier it is to defend it. But they were all in what was going to become the demilitarized zone. And so they were fighting for ground that everybody knew they were going to have to give up. But it seemed they still wanted to try and affect that armistice. So Kum Song is the absolute end of the war and the fighting then. I haven't looked for the last people to be killed in the war, but they will certainly be at Kum Song. I mentioned earlier Stalin's death, and really, while Stalin was alive, then he wasn't going to give up on this war. He was, to some extent, mainly involved now with supplying equipment, but he was tying up vast numbers of Americans. He was particularly tying up vast numbers of American naval and air forces. And he wasn't losing many troops. He did have troops there, but very few. So from Stalin's point of view, this war was absolutely what he wanted. And it was really his death, and then the new Khrushchev, Bulganin, and so on, group who just thought, we've got just too much on. We've got to cope with Stalin's death. This is one war. We're not saying you can't fight it, but saying we're not going to support you anymore. And at that point, the Chinese and the North Koreans decide that they will come. And they signed the armistice agreement on the 27th of July. So this war has gone on for 3 years, and most of it has been stalemate. Only the first 7 months you see a real war of movement. Again, not dissimilar from the First World War. This is just a very quick one. And again, people in the audience, you may not be able to see this. The term limited war is used a lot now, but it was actually coined for this war. And then people applied it retrospectively to other wars. Why was this a limited war? The main one was that nobody used nuclear weapons, and the Russians and the Americans both had them. So they made a very conscious decision that they were not going to go down that line, particularly for this war. The second is the territory. It stays on the Korean mainland throughout. MacArthur would have expanded into China, but he wasn't going to be allowed to. And so it was something that was limited again in territory, which very often these wars do overspill. Think of Vietnam, it's overspilling into Laos, Cambodia, and so on. This one, mainly because of the way Korea is held to one territory. But the third one is the aims. The Americans particularly had no aim to invade China. Once China realized that they weren't going to take the whole of Korea, they limited their aims too. And so you have the first limited war for all those reasons. And I say it's now been applied retrospectively back to wars particularly in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. But this really was the first limited war. If you can't see the casualties, I just put them up. North Korea is shown as losing about 600,000 civilians and 1.5 million military wounded. South Korea, a lot more civilians, but a lot less military wounded. I think to some extent, this is how you classify. More of the North Korean civilians were involved as soldiers. Both sides are losing something like, the South Koreans lose either killed or wounded, about 1.5 million of their population, and it's about 2 million from the north. China has the Chinese tactics for these mass attacks against modern weapons. They take enormous casualties. So China is willing to accept 600,000 deaths for this war, and that's massive. But you've got to think of it in terms of the way Mao was thinking at the time, and the battle he's just fought with the nationalists, and his determination to hold on to China. And I think that perhaps accounts for it. The American actually lost 36,000 dead, which was considered pretty massive. It was bigger than any one part of the Second World War, though of course they lost more people in the war. And the US forces, the United Nations other forces only lost about 3,000. So the people who suffered in this war were the Koreans and the Chinese to some extent. I'm going to finish now. I've managed 50 minutes, Trevor. So whoever's got your money on 50 minutes, you've won. I will take questions, and as I say, I left out the British, and I'm happy to talk about that if anyone wants to ask.